Hi, Mariam. Welcome to the Conversations with Coopman podcast, and thank you so much for joining us today. We're also joined by my colleague and co-founder, Andrew Murphy.
Hi, Mariam.
Hi, guys. Nice to be with you both today.
Brilliant to have you on, and very much looking forward to this discussion. Really keen to learn more about you and your experience and career in the investment fund industry, and really talk about the inspiring work you and your team have been doing at BWAM, which was set up by Mariam and her co-founders in 2019. Mariam, we've given the audience an introduction to you, but perhaps you can tell us more about how you started in private equity and tell us about where you are now with your career.
Thanks. So I didn't know about private equity when I began university, but the internships I had whilst I was studying kind of opened my eyes to this world of corporate law. I think looking back at it, it was a clear example of how expanding a young person's sphere of thought can really have an impact on their future. So I had a number of internships which led me to corporate law. And at the time we called them vacation schemes. I'm not sure what they're called now, but I eventually had a training contract at a pan-European corporate law firm that had a specialism in private equity. The majority of my training contract was PE focused, and I qualified into the firm's investment funds practice. And whilst I was a junior associate, I gained experience in advising clients on fund formation, fundraising, and fund operation matters. And I've had an interest since I was junior associate in emerging markets and responsible investments and also impact investing. And those negotiations with the investor base that spanned from emerging markets to European buyouts and also to infrastructure, it was a really great eye-opener in terms of the changing face of investor expectation in the private investment funds industry and also the PE landscape as a whole since then. So where I am now is that I'm a General Counsel at Emerging Markets Partners Limited. So Arch is an owner-managed investment firm, advisory firm, and it was founded in 2018, and it specialises in private equity opportunities across jurisdictions. And I'm responsible for all aspects of the company's legal functions. So that includes fund formation and fundraising for our various investment strategies, legal oversight in terms of the investment process, deal structuring, transaction management oversight, and then also the company matters, so reorganizations, operational changes, input on some HR and employment matters as well. And then I also oversee our company secretarial and investment advisory committees. So it's a really wide role being an in-house general counsel. And since I've been in-house, I've witnessed the changing role of GCs. A lot of people mentioned it when I was in private practice, but now I'm on the other side and see what that really means. It's much more about business advisory functions, I would say. And there's an emphasis on being commercial and understanding the business, and also being able to advise the various stakeholders and the board on risks, current risks, and also evolving risks. So I would say that the GC of a firm, especially within the private equity industry and in-house legal departments, they're no longer just about fixing the problem. They're about understanding investment funds, understanding investor expectations, and advising on both, and also the company's requirements.
Thanks, Mariam. And it's certainly interesting to hear about the changes that you're seeing in the role and have seen over the past few years. I think you referenced just at the start the changes in the investment landscape and in investor expectations since you started. And I think the current situation that we're facing now is a monumental shift in terms of kind of sustainability. But I suppose from your perspective, when we look at the private equity and wider asset management sector, what changes are you seeing?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. So Arch, as I said, is emerging markets focused. So the expectation of some of our investors may have been more nuanced to some before. So, for example, development finance institutions have always had more of a focus on ESG, so environmental, social, and governance matters. And they have an expectation on the investment firms that they commit to report on things like that. I would say that there's probably more of a focus on the E and the G for some investors, not just DFIs. However, over time, that has certainly evolved, and you can see that now. There are more investors, not just the likes of development finance institutions or pension funds that are focused on sustainability, but actually institutional investors are as well. And regulation and industry bodies are showing that as well. For example, if we think about ILPA, which is an organisation that represents limited partners primarily for the PE space, they've recently launched a diversity in action, which is focused on looking at how diversity can be assessed in terms of the GPs and managers in which limited partners are giving their money to. We also obviously have the recent European regulation, which is completely focused on sustainability, the SFDR, and that's really looking at trying to make sure that investment firms are doing what they say they're doing, in a nutshell. And I welcome it. Having worked in the EM space and looking at responsible investment for a while, there are a number of firms that have been doing the job anyway, but then there are also some investment firms that have been playing up to it. And I think there does need to be a focus on what is ESG, how can it be measured, and how can you provide that information to investors. And I think the investment firms that are able to evidence that, there may be a shift in terms of where commitments are being made.
And you talk about ILPA, who I think have over 500 member institutions. They manage 2 trillion of AUM, which is, I think, 50% of the global private equity AUM in total. So huge responsibility, and for them to put diversity in action as kind of a core focus, and to encourage diversity. That's one part of it, and it's great to see, and they'll obviously guide and assist. But in terms of the firms then being on the other side, I suppose, in your opinion, Mariam, or any thoughts on this, but how can firms maybe improve their own recruitment strategy to be able to facilitate and encourage that diversity as well?
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of ways that this can be looked at. And for example, as I said at the beginning in my introduction, I didn't know about private equity when I joined this world, and I know I probably must have made a lot of faux pas, and it just was an alien concept to me. And having looked back, I went to a decent school, and then I got a training contract in a good firm, and that that trajectory moved on. But I think looking at firms now, and if we're focused on diversity and having a broad base of investment professionals, which statistics have shown actually is good for the business, it's about looking at different ways of encouraging people to look at the industry. So whether it's at the grassroots and having more engagement with universities that aren't necessarily thought about, then also considering recruitment from an angle that isn't just focused on an MBA from a particular institution, for example, but people who might be changing their careers, or people who have had education but in different jurisdictions even. I think that there needs to be a shift from a fairly narrow remit when it comes to recruitment practices for, if I focus on the industry I work in, the private equity space.
We've talked about how firms can improve their sort of recruitment strategy and encourage diversity there, Mariam, and you mentioned sort of university qualification and degrees, and I guess that's from a kind of entry perspective and from a candidate interest perspective as well. But what are your thoughts on recruitment and inclusion, I guess, as a factor that requires a bit more further attention for when creating a culture and an inclusive culture?
Yeah, I mean, I think these points are very much from the perspective of my experience and the experience of others who are ethnic minorities or just different, because diversity is not just what you see, but it covers a number of things, and there are intersections which I myself aren't experiencing. But post-recruitment inclusion is key, and what I would say from the experience that I've had which actually was fairly positive when I look back at my initial legal career. Integration, I believe, shouldn't be the burden of the person who is different. Integration actually should be the focus of the organisation that is bringing people in. So that there needs to be a more open culture. Having diversity and inclusion policies for the purposes of recruitment is important. But then there also needs to be diversity and inclusion policies for the purposes of your staff, which a lot of organisations do have. And then when it comes to those diversity and inclusion policies, it's also about implementing them. And that can span from training on things such as implicit bias, but it also requires having processes in place when there's explicit bias, and being able to have an institution that allows people to call out if something is going wrong, or be able to put their hand up if they feel that they need support. And I guess anecdotally, there also needs to be some way of encouraging people to just be themselves, and training and or having a culture of accepting the difference. And I think one example I always think about when I entered the corporate world was that there was actually quite a diverse pool of training candidates that I trained with. But by the end of our training contract, all of the male candidates were wearing chinos and a certain jacket on a Friday, along with, I think they're called boat shoes. And whilst that's not a problem because they were climatized into the situation that they had ended up in, for those individuals who didn't want to wear the boat shoes and chinos, we need to have a culture where that's okay. So I do think that it's post-recruitment, it's really it's on the institutions to think about how do you open up your employee base so that they feel comfortable to just be themselves, and also feel comfortable to call on their experiences that might be different but actually would be of benefit to the organizations they work for, whether it's a law firm or a private equity house.
For those firms, I'd imagine, Mariam, I don't know if you agree, that's probably driven in part by authentic leadership, enabling their employees to be individualistic within their organization and not necessarily following set processes, but looking at the company in an organic view. I mean, if that is somewhat lacking, there isn't that authentic leadership in place, and companies don't necessarily focus their recruitment strategies around diversity and then have that inclusiveness thereafter. What do you think will happen to those firms?
Well, I mean, it's fairly, from my perspective, it's fairly simple. I think we have an attrition of individuals who may not feel that they belong, and that is not of benefit to the organizations that are trying to encourage diversity. I mean, we started off by talking about some of the other industry bodies and what they're doing in terms of diversity in action. ILPA is an institution of limited partners. If they representing limited partners, if those limited partners are not seeing what they think is important, it actually can have an impact on the firms that are trying to fundraise, right? Because essentially they are not servicing an industry. So that's the business side. The other side is obviously it's just right to try and be diverse. But ultimately, Andrew, I think it's attrition and a loss of very good talent.
And, we talk about the sort of attrition of individuals there, Mariam, that probably don't feel like they belong in a firm. And I must admit, I'm guilty of owning a pair of boat shoes. So, but I kind of understand sort of where you're sort of coming from. And I guess what we're talking about, sort of attrition, it's interesting that you sort of mentioned that. And, doing our sort of research on BWAM and what you're doing with your co-founders. Isn't that one of the main reasons why you created BWAM? And can you tell us more about BWAM and what you're doing?
Sure, thank you. And I will continue with BWAM. So Black Women in Asset Management was founded, as I think you said, when we started our conversation in 2019. And on that point about attrition and feeling different, it began from a chance meeting with myself and co-founder Jacqueline Taiwo. we realized that we were in an industry where we weren't seeing many of us. And well, we didn't realize it was the case, but we wanted to see if there were more women out there, Black women, who are in the industry, and essentially foster that point of peer engagement and peer support. So we began in 2019, and we started off with ad hoc private dining room dinners, which allowed women that were in the industry to connect and also share ideas, share stories, and support each other. And I would say, going back to the last point we were discussing, that support is something that's really key for the institutions who are trying to encourage diversity. I'll reference Hashim Mohammed here. He has a book called People Like Us, and there's something that he said that I thought really stood out, and that's the power of social capital and also cultural capital. And the essence when it comes to cultural capital is the confidence in having a feeling of belonging. And what he goes on to say is that a minority cannot necessarily build that feeling of belonging on their own. The reason why I'm quoting that is because it really does, I think, link to what we've done with Black Women in Asset Management. What we were fostering was that feeling of belonging within the asset management industry to encourage support. So we formalized in 2019, and our mission is essentially to show the amazing work that Black women are doing in the industry and to highlight their successes, and then also to provide Black women in the industry tools to enable them to thrive. And we've done that through various ways. As I mentioned, we started off with networking events, which have continued, albeit virtually now. We also have a number of career events, so development workshops, specific training workshops as well. And we've had a number of inspirational keynotes, including women in the asset management industry that are leading, investment banking professionals and women fund managers that are at the head of their institutions. And then the final pillar is outreach initiatives. And that goes back to the point I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, trying to essentially move the needle when it comes to asset management industry and its reach. And that goes from partnering with organizations for university students to helping organizations when it comes to internship candidates. And then also reaching out to early career women in the industry as well, especially when they are themselves trying to foster that feeling of belonging within an organization, which often they may be one of very few.
We mentioned, Mariam, and I suppose at the part of the call as well, where we talked around kind of the attrition rate and, the mid-senior professionals that are maybe moving on due to a lack of inclusiveness. As part of BWAM's focus, you do run the Leadership Accelerator program as well. I suppose we're wondering, did you create this particular program with that issue in mind? And I suppose what impact have you seen from that program so far?
Yeah, I mean, thank you. We just recently launched the Leadership Accelerator, and we're hoping that it will become an annual program. But yes, the aim of the Accelerator is to help those women who are significantly underrepresented in the industry, and it's just beginning actually. So I can let you know about the feedback from it once the first program is over. But the intention is to help those women to be able to articulate their aims within the industry and move forward, and then also to try and help accelerate their careers within their respective institutions and encourage more leadership at the top, because that's also part of the feeling of belonging that's required. It's also being able to see yourself at the top at a later stage. So it's a program that will consist of a number of bespoke training sessions, and also coaching. And it will be a cohort of women that will also then be able to foster peer engagement and relationship building, and then hopefully provide them with tools to get to that next stage of their various institutions. We have women from asset management firms to law firms to compliance professionals as well within the first cohort.
That's brilliant. And so taking this right the way back to the beginning of the discussion then, and we talked about, you not actually knowing what private equity was and getting into an internship and looking at the kind of outreach initiatives for young Black women that perhaps are looking for a career in investment. Can you talk a little bit more about that and I guess how maybe some people in our audience would be able to engage and maybe reach out?
Sure. So we are here to encourage and assist women that are joining the industry. Before that, there's also the element of trying to get more people to understand and know about the industry. And Black Women in Asset Management has partnered with organisations for that purpose. So we have worked with women who are at universities who may not necessarily know about PE. So very similar to myself. I think from the perspective of institutions within asset management industry, within investment funds, there are a couple of things that can be done. So working with recruiters and actively encouraging their recruiters to look for candidates from diverse backgrounds. And when it comes to looking at those candidates from diverse backgrounds, it's not just, it involves looking further than your typical red brick universities. It also involves having recruitment practices that take into account intersectionality and how that can be a benefit, how resilience can often be an asset, and how the typical backgrounds of some candidates, whilst it's what's usually expected when it comes to internships and work experience, there may be other aspects of a candidate that can also make them as equally viable or capable to perform a role. So that conversation with the recruiters that asset management firms are working with, so that the recruiters are able to provide as a diverse pool as possible, I think is key. And then when it comes to the interview practice, is being cognizant of that as well. I then also think organisations such as ourselves, I'm going to go in with a plug here, is really important to partner with. So we have a number of pillars, as I mentioned, and we are here to encourage diversity, help diversity grow, and eventually have more diverse leaders within the asset management industry. So I think if investment firms are really focused on increasing the diversity of their organisations, they partnering with the likes of Black Women in Asset Management really can help them with that. We are providing our members the tools to be able to do better in their respective roles. We're providing peer engagement so that when they might feel that they are a minority and don't have an outreach, they can come to other members within BWAM. And I mean, we have grown now to over 500 members and we're still growing. And that's, I think, a testament to the fact that this kind of organisation is needed. And we are working with institutions already and are looking to continue to work with institutions to try and increase the diversity of the asset management landscape and essentially boast the diverse leadership of the industry.
Thanks for that, Mariam. And I suppose just to conclude, I think it's on a parting note, it's very much a case that, as I said at the start of the call, there's a monumental shift, and you mentioned kind of ESG with the focus very much of being on E&G, and within the social element of that, in order for that to be successful, diversity really is key. And it's just fantastic to hear that underpinning that are peer groups like BWAM that are really, I suppose, enhancing the power of social and cultural capital, as you quoted, to engage and drive awareness for that diversity to occur, and ultimately for the whole sustainability movement to be a success. So really do tip our hats to you for the work that you're doing, and wish you every success with that peer group moving forward. And I'm sure you're going to have a positive impact on lots of people's careers and lives. So thank you very much for taking the time to speak to myself and Will this morning. And we wish you all the best with that, and also with your very busy career as a GC.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Will. It's been great to talk to you both, and thanks for giving me the platform to talk about Black women in asset management.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on Conversations with Coopman. If you are looking to hire excellent talent or considering your next career move in front office, risk, compliance, or accounting, please reach out to a member of our specialist recruitment team. If you have any questions about the financial services market, feel free to leave a comment below and we will get back to you soon. And if you like this podcast episode, we'd greatly appreciate a video like, or even better, subscribe to our channel to stay up to date with our latest releases.